There have been numerous efforts on the part of the left, the socialists, Democrats, to say they were innocent. They tried deny, 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 and they keep repeating the denials. And eventually that has some effect for them. To counter their denials, again, they were convicted by a jury of their peers. There's a fellow named Alan Dershowitz. Any of you know Alan Dershowitz? Very strong civil rights libertarian.
He's not a libertarian.
Well,
he's a neoconservative and he teaches at Yale.
I would disagree with you on that, but it's irrelevant.
So would I.
Dershowitz is known for not being a fan of the legal system. He reviewed all of the records and concluded they were guilty. Then a fellow named Nikita Khrushchev, remember him? The premier of or head of the Russian or Soviet government, faced off with Kennedy at the Bay of Pigs, not Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. He published memoirs, actually his son published them, he died by then, back in 1992. And one of the things that he said there was that both Stalin and Molotov, who was like the Soviet Secretary of State back then, were very complimentary of the work the Rosenbergs had done, and it allowed the Russians or the Soviets to very quickly match the American nuclear program. So I think these are pretty solid arguments. You can read other things. Again, I told you their strategy was to deny, 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 which will say that they were innocent. That'd be up to you. You'd have to read that. But I think the proof is overwhelming that they were Soviet agents, all 6 of them. The House on Un-American Activities, or HUAC as it's called, was an activity, again, of the House of Representatives. Major players there were people they were investigating. Alger Hiss, who was a very high-ranking member of the State Department. He was convicted of perjury. He was sentenced to 5 years. He served 3.5, but he went to jail. Harry Dexter White, remember that name? That was the name from the Brownell, said that Truman had promoted. He testified before the HUAC, and then he had a heart attack and died before he could be charged with anything. A fellow named Lachlan Curry, that's the fellow that was trying to kill the Monona Project. He testified before HUAC. Then he took off, left the country, and went to Colombia. Spent most of the rest of his life in Colombia. A fellow named Frank Coe. He testified before the HUAC. Then he left and went to Red China. Worked for the Red Chinese for the rest of his life. A fellow named Lawrence Dugan, Treasury Department guy. Coe was a Treasury Department guy. Anyway, Dugan testified before HUAC and promptly committed suicide. So these people committed or did some odd things, and one of them was actually convicted convicted of perjury by the court. The major thing that occurred during that HUAC investigation was what I'm going to call the Whittaker-Chambers versus Alger Hiss battle, and it became a battle royal. Alger Hiss, again, a very high-ranking member of the State Department, he and Chambers had been members of a little communist cell going back to the 1930s. Chambers became disillusioned with the Communist Party, particularly Stalin, and left the Communist Party just before World War II. He saw Alger Hiss advancing quite rapidly in the State Department. And he privately went to different people in the State Department and told them that Hiss and he had both been communists in this cell together. And he thought that they ought to be taking a good look at his security and his loyalty. FDR knew about it. He was a big friend with his. He just pushed it off. Other people pushed it off. FDR wasn't going to do anything about it. They weren't going to do anything about it. Chambers then kind of just faded into obscurity until this HUAC, who had been put together to study the penetration of Soviet agents in the government, found out about his reporting Hiss earlier on, and they called him to testify before their committee. He again named Hiss as a member of this communist cell. Hiss denied it. This deny. The Democrats, high-ranking Democrats, all stood behind Hiss and denied it. The charge was going no place, but there was a young junior congressman named Richard Nixon, we've all heard of him, who was on that committee. He refused to let that go. He then saw that the Democrats were going to do what we now call running out the clock. People would lose interest and it would fade away. He conducted, I'm not going to say secret, but private hearings of his own, which were not covered by the press, and developed more information about Hiss and his ties to the Communist Party. They were about to drop the whole Hiss investigation when Nixon came out and publicly announced all of his findings. Now remember, back in those days, the press was still leaning to the left, but they actually did something called fair and balanced reporting. So they reported what Nixon had told people, and that created another stir about Alger Hiss and about the lack of security within our government. This time, the Democrats went absolutely ballistic in their defense of Alger Hiss. Harry Truman, then the sitting president, asked his attorney general to indict Chambers for perjury. Dean Acheson, who became the Secretary of State, stood up and strongly endorsed Hiss, told the public that he was not a communist and this was just a lot of bull. Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1952 and 1956, strongly supported and endorsed Hiss. Felix Frankfurter, who eventually became a Supreme Court justice, made him Hiss's unofficial lawyer during the HUAC investigations, and he became Hiss's lawyer when he was indicted for perjury. Now, can you for a minute imagine having that kind of prestige thrown against you and calling you a liar? A president, a future presidential nominee, a Secretary of State, a Supreme Court justice, and a host of other people. Here's Chambers. Well, the Democrats weren't satisfied with just doing that. They then moved on to what we call the politics of personal destruction, based on the Clinton years, and mounted this personal attack on Chambers. They accused him of being mentally unstable. He was nuts. They accused him of being a homosexual. Now remember, today they wouldn't do something like that, because homosexuals are in.
Yeah.
But back then he was accused of being a homosexual. Then, what I think was the dirtiest of them all, they accused Chambers of having a homosexual relationship with his brother, who had mental problems, the brother had, and wound up killing himself. But they accused him of having a homosexual relationship with his brother. That's the extent how far they went to damage his credibility. Now, think back. Remember Vietnam? Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Same strategy. Hoover, well, he's been the world's worst conniver and all his secret files, and oh, he too was a homosexual, and you know, they did a pretty good job of destroying his reputation. Nixon, well, I don't feel so sorry for Nixon because he handed his head on a platter to the Democrats. Reagan was mentally unstable. He was a cowboy. He was a dumb actor. Remember Ken Starr? Had any of you ever heard of Ken Starr before Monica and the Watergate investigation? But remember him? He became the worst guy since McCarthy, according to the Democrats. Clarence Thomas, remember him? Remember recently a guy named George W. Bush? So you see this constant strain of how they go after people's personal reputation. There is no limit to what will be said about the people they want to destroy. Well, they played this whole game on Chambers. Now, Chambers was no dummy. All this starts happening, he figures, hey, I'm in a fight for my economic life, my personal life, and my professional life. Before the attack on him had occurred, he had never mentioned the names or the activities of any other people in the cell or that he knew or thought were associated with the Communist Party. He then began naming other names and other people, and he began documenting, not documenting, but elaborating and bringing out the facts that proved his case. He realized he couldn't protect his old friends, so he said, it's never me, and I'm not going to let him get away with this. Major incidents that occurred were the promontory warbler. Now that's a bird, and bird watchers, that's a very rare bird. Bird watchers love to get promontory warblers. You know, it's like seeing Bigfoot or something, I guess. Anyway, remember that Hiss had denied being a member of the Communist Party. He actually denied even knowing Chambers. Chambers told people that Hiss was a bird watcher and had told him the story of when he saw his promontory warbler. Not Nixon, but a couple of the other members of Nixon's committee, that secret or private committee that investigated out of the limelight. They picked up on that story, and one of those guys, in one of those down minutes breaks during the investigation, engaged Hiss in a conversation about birds and things, and it led to Hiss telling him the story of what he saw of a promontory warbler. Now, this was something that only someone that knew Hiss personally would know about. So that destroyed Hiss's allegation that he didn't know him and had never worked with him in any way. Then there were what were called the pumpkin papers. These were notes, some of them not all that important, some of them very important, which Hiss had typed up and passed along to Chambers. Chambers had somehow made copies of these. I know that it wasn't like today when you go and make a Xerox copy. He had these copies, and he'd hidden them, and he didn't know why he did it at the time, on some property of his. And he'd hidden them out in the field where they grew pumpkins. He went and dug up with members of the committee, and maybe it was members of the jury by this time. No, it was members of the committee. They went to the pumpkin patch and dug up these papers that Hiss had passed along to him. There were actual signatures and directions. They verified that the writing, the handwriting, was Hiss's. And these papers became known as the pumpkin patch papers because they'd been kept there. Also, Hiss kept denying, and as far as the typewriter, he said he didn't own a typewriter like this. Well, it turned out his father-in-law had given a typewriter that was used to type these up to his daughter, which was, of course, Hiss's wife, And that's where he had typed, the machine that he'd used to type up the notes from. And they were able, the FBI was able to eventually find that typewriter and match it up.